That morning, North Vietnam has increased its military aggression in all these areas, and particularly in Cambodia. I have concluded that the time has come for action.
In the early 1970s, near the closing of the Vietnam War, people were becoming upset about the actions that President Nixon was taking in a war that we did not need to fight. During the Vietnam War, more than 400,000 civilians died from war-related injuries. The U.S. alone suffered 47,000 men and women killed in action, 11,000 non-combat deaths, along with 150,000 wounded and 10,000 missing. To try to help South Vietnam with the war, Nixon issued the invasion of Cambodia.
Has stripped away all pretense of respecting the sovereignty or the neutrality of Cambodia.
This enraged the people of the United States, and the most affected were the college students who were demanding an end to the war. These students protested all over the United States, trying to reverse the actions declared by Nixon. On October 15, 1969, there was a rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial. After the rally was finished, they began to wave flags of red, blue, and gold, symbolizing the Viet Cong. 50,000 protesters began to march toward the Pentagon. Soon after, violence broke out due to the soldiers who were trying to protect the Pentagon from the protesters. For the first time in United States history, the American support for the war had fallen below 50%. Out of the colleges that took part in the protest, Kent State University was the most adamant about protesting this action performed by Nixon. They held many rallies and community protests after the announcement from President Nixon. The protests started on May 1st, 1970, and continued for the following days. They started out with peaceful sit-ins, and around 500 students took part in the protest. Soon, the amount attending the protest rapidly increased over the following days to over 2,000. The peaceful protests soon turned violent when the protesters started acting more like rioters. These protests are what sparked the governor to send in the National Guard to handle the situation. Many students threw rocks and other objects back at the National Guardsmen. On the night of May 2, 1970, protesters set the ROTC building on fire. This was a devastating blow to the community, and because of the fire, they became labeled as rioters by many government officials. With the arrival of the 77 National Guard members, the threat of a much larger outbreak occurred, and the National Guard were ordered to handle the crowd. They threw tear gas as a form of dealing with the crowd. This proved to be fruitless due to the wind that day. These protesters began throwing things back at the guardsmen and yelling taunts. These actions by the protesters provoked the guardsmen to fire into the crowd. 67 shots were fired and 17 people were hit. 4 people died as a result, and 13 people were injured, and of those injured, 1 person was forever paralyzed because of these events. As it was mentioned in the book, 67 Shots, Kent State and the End of American Innocence, violence was in the air and terror rang through the campus. This helps depict the state of morale and tension at Kent State during this crisis. Protests like these inspired many more around the United States. Jackson State was another well-known college that this occurred at. On May 15, 1970, just 11 days after the Kent State shootings, college students organized a 100-student protest similar to those at Kent State. At Jackson State, 75 police units were called in to handle the protest, and they fired 140 shots in 30 seconds. 2 people were killed and 12 were wounded.
The year was 1970. Tragedy was everywhere. Vietnam, Kent State, and yes, Jackson State College.
Nixon said he began the invasion of Cambodia in order to cut off the North Vietnamese supply line from reaching North Vietnam. But without the public knowledge at the time, Nixon started a bombing campaign in Cambodia months before the initial invasion. This was known among military and government officials as Operation Breakfast. Nixon had promised the American people that American troops would be returning home soon, and once he initiated the invasion of Cambodia, the American people knew that this reality was not going to happen, and they were filled with anger and hatred toward the Vietnam War. The Kent State shootings began a nationwide outbreak of student protest. These protests around America involved around 4 million college students and successfully shut down 850 colleges. Nixon later spoke at the Lincoln Memorial at 4 a.m. to explain to the restless college students his reasoning for the invasion of Cambodia.
I said then that I was making that decision despite our concern over increased enemy activity in Laos, in Cambodia, and in South Vietnam. And at that time, I warned that if I concluded that increased enemy activity in any of these areas endangered the lives of Americans remaining in Vietnam, I would not hesitate to take strong and effective measures to deal with that situation.
Nixon then reactivated the Houston Plan, which allowed for wiretapping, break-ins, and other illegal surveillance of anti-war groups. Nixon became worried that this method against the college students would end the same way as it had with the French 2 years prior, a nationwide student brigade that almost completely overthrew the government regime that President de Gaulle had constructed. These protests continued to spread, and soon more violent actions were taken by the United States military against these protesters. This caused President Nixon to collapse under all the pressure, and he immediately began to withdraw soldiers from Cambodia.
And will these protests affect your policy in any way?
No. They're trying to say that they want peace. They're trying to say that they want to stop the killing. They're trying to say that they want to end the draft. They're trying to say that we ought to get out of Vietnam. I agree with everything that they're trying to accomplish.
Things like the draft lottery gave people something even larger to protest. These actions effectively gave people rallying a much larger voice. President Nixon soon began to realize the ramifications of these actions at home and in Vietnam. Furthermore, the protests at home were causing a widespread resentment of Nixon and the war efforts in Vietnam. In 1973, the Nixon administration began to reevaluate the Vietnam policy. During 1973, the efforts to end the war in Vietnam had begun. He started the withdrawal of troops and began to discontinue war efforts.
I announced the decision to withdraw an additional 150,000 Americans from Vietnam over the next year.
The events of Kent State forever changed the way we as Americans view protest. The students at Kent State took a stand against what they felt was unchecked power and demonstrated their First Amendment rights. Unfortunately, these demonstrations took a turn for the worse, but had countless repercussions throughout all of America. These changes in American society can be felt even today with the changes to the National Guard towards carrying live ammunition. This is David Williams, who served in the National Guard during this time period.
What effect did the Kent State Massacre have on the National Guard?
I joined the National Guard in 1971, and when the massacre occurred, the powers decided that the Guard was not trained well enough to go out and take care of domestic type uprisings. Unfortunately, in the 1970, when Kent State occurred, even though the students attacked with force, it was not deadly, and the Guard retaliated with live ammunition. At that point in time, we went through a lot of training on how to handle civil disturbances, and we were basically disarmed.
The people in America are still not happy with the way the government handles war and hostile nations today. After the recent election of the President Donald Trump and his executive order for the Muslim ban, otherwise known as a travel ban, many colleges and universities have spoken out with on-campus rallies. The sacrifice of young lives needs to be put towards something greater than situations like these. The events of Kent State should never have played out the way they did, due to Nixon's ineffective leadership when it came to dealing with affairs at home. When it comes down to it, these events could have been avoided in a set of better circumstances, but this is what occurred, and this is what caused Kent State.